thank you very much. Thanks for joining this talk. So I'm really looking forward to giving this talk because the audience is quite broad and has very different flavors in research. So on the one hand, I think a lot of imaging people and machine learning people are here, but I also see a lot of mathematics people in statistics and optimization being interested in. And I try to, on the one hand, bridge with my talk a little bit the different areas. So you will see some application, but you will also see some mathematical elements. What I want to highlight today is how autoencoders can help inverse problems that are very important for medical imaging, but also how autoencoders can be used to learn operators like differential equations, or the right-hand side of differential equations, but also in the comparable way how autoencoders can be used to structure data, like what we heard already today, the PCA-related autoencoders. So I try to shed light on those aspects and how they are related. That's one of my main focus points. So to give a rough overview, I will focus on the robustness in solving inverse problems that appear in medical imaging. I will relate it to something that might be missing when you just work with unrolled schemes. So we have already learned from Ozan Öktem about the unrolled schemes. That is some sort of gradient flow structure that people usually in functional analysis would like to have. So that you have an energy, and if you minimize it, that you have a nice decay that you can prove and get. And the third part is really the aspect that connects optimal transport, data clustering, but also operator learning. And that's the idea of analyzing latent structures, latent representations. So this is the vision that I have, that I work for right now in my research. I really like to see as much as possible connections from the top to the bottom. So how we can translate the classical variational frameworks for solving inverse problems and PD theory to the machine learning area. And I think regularization theory is one of those aspects that is quite obvious. But you can also think about the representation of data in such problems. So if you think about the singular value decomposition, that was one of the first approaches for regularizing inverse problems, if you think about the truncated SVD. This is one view that you can have when you compare variational networks or variational methods and deep networks. They share a lot of similarities. So maybe you see much more. But these are the ones that I find quite prominent right now in literature. So you see that the variational networks resemble the norms or the semi-norms that you usually would like to model. And they are automatically detected within the activation functions in a deep net. So people think about is it better to have a leaky ReLU versus a more strict one? Is a sigmoid better? Because in neuroscience, people have thought about this quite a lot. So there are certain choices, and I think they have, in some way, equivalences or the resemblance in functional analysis. Differential operators are clearly related to the convolutional components. So if you think about diffusion, convection equations, that's very clear that you could resemble something of that, but how much? Then there is the idea of scattering networks, for example, by Malin, that clearly connects to multiscale properties. We also have a lot of ideas about this from gradient flows, like Bregman iterations or scale space methods were a clear connection here. If you think about regularization theory, it stabilizes usually a system. So that means with less data in uncertain scenarios, you can get still reasonable results. So we often see that people remove parts of the training sets and would still want to be as good as before. Or people remove time-dependent elements and try to interpolate through the latent space and more to make that reliable. So I think that's in some way related to generalization, but how much? What is very intriguing is that if you think about generative networks, you always have a forward map and a backward map. So that's usually, these are the two agents that interact in a generative network, especially in a generative adversarial network. That could be related to the crucial formulation of inverse problems, but maybe there are other ways of doing it. And then you can think about it from a more neuroscience point of view. Often people think about several populations interacting. So for example, different biochemical species. So you can think about activating cells versus more suppressing cells. So that is where multimodality in medical imaging is related. So you have different types of data, they have their own structure, but they have to interact to be strong, like in PDs. And the last one I think is really interesting in terms of delay differential equations. So you make use of some implicitness or some memory, and that also happens in all the different fields. Quite obvious. So what I like very much is that you can see differential equations nowadays as recurrent neural networks. So that makes this connection quite natural and quite obvious. If you look at it from a more abstract view, then there are a lot of works right now where people identify the mathematical questions behind deep learning. But what it boils down to is often an architecture design or a certain class that you want to find with certain properties. Then the optimization that often addresses stochasticity or non-convexity and avoiding saddle points, making it more reliable to be generalizable. But also dealing with the adversarial cases. So being able to not switching the class when you go from one sample with a small noise to another. That is what I would call regularization, because adversarial cases are exactly the ill-posedness that we want to avoid when we solve for the unknowns. And you see on the right-hand side of your picture, you see what could go wrong when the generalization doesn't work, so that you lose the clustering of your data. From a total variation point of view or functional analytical point of view, you could say the level set structure is gone. So is maybe the geometry in the latent space important for generalization? Likely. This is another view on it that gives a little bit the different communities working on mathematics of deep learning right now, and it's definitely not complete. But you could say that they share a lot in the application when you think about inverse problems. So there is the recurrent neural network area where people work on ODE theory and connect it to timescales. There are more the functional analytical people and the harmonic analysis people thinking about variational networks and representation theory. But also people more focused on the optimization. So you can think about learned proximal point methods, learning these unrolled schemes, but also bi-level optimization is crucial. So you have often two different goals to overcome. And then there is for sure the generalization in terms of geometry. So you want to put things on graphs, or you want to understand an underlying graph structure behind the scenery. And what I find very intriguing is that the nonlinear eigenvalue problems that we often study in PDs, those are the ones that resemble the structure behind the equations. They seem to be at the interface of graphs approximation theory. So an approximation theory would be the invariance, but also in terms of variational networks when you look for the eigenvalue problems. And I would like to highlight some of those aspects a little bit in this talk. So now the very applied part. So I'm involved in a very large project in the Netherlands on crossing all the technical universities about precision medicine. And this is an idea that we came up with mathematicians, physicists, but also very applied medical people. And it resembles a little bit what's happening in this room. So you have on the one hand people that are very applied and work with the data. That would be more, let's say, on this side. But there are also people that maybe have a good idea about how to generate the images and have certain assumptions on the models. And often as mathematicians, we are kind of have to know both worlds, but we are thinking about it from a more abstract point of view. And I think building this bridge either from left to right or from right to left is a crucial point to be successful in applications and in theory. So the big challenges are the ones that we all know for sure. So sparsity, big data, multidimensionality, heterogeneity in the data, nonlinear parts, if you think about the different PDs coming up here, but also super resolution if you think about less training data giving you the same quality. So here I see right now two tendencies that you see in literature. Either people go from left to right or from right to left. So the left to right is you take a classical physics inversion approach, classical inverse problem, and you enrich it by deep learning by identifying some small uncertain parameters you are not sure about. Could be a regularization parameter or some other hidden variable. And you therefore get more robustness, but also get a better idea what is wrong in the system. So it's really the Bayesian, the uncertainty viewpoint. The other one would be you are really a data scientist on the right-hand side completely, and you try to create an additional structure behind the black box deep learning, enriching constraints in the physics. So you want to know, is what is generated with a gun really physical? Is it physics enforced, physics induced? And there you also see latent data structures and robustness that pays off. So for example, at the SIAM CSE conference recently, these were the two dominant streamlines I saw. So I will give you two applications. One that is more focusing on this side, going from left to right. And I will show you one application where we go from right to left and try to give you some background information. So this is a project Cancer ID. It's also a EU project where we've tried to find needles in haystacks. So we take blood samples of patients and we try to identify where the cells are, and we want to classify them and to optimally even sort them to make clear predictions about the patient. So how much time is left, how strong should the therapy be, and so on. What is the very time-consuming part is that you have to do this usually manually by taking the samples in the blood, and then people look at the images and draw the labels. So they create training data some way. But this is not feasible if you have larger sets. And what you would like to have is a really clear hazard ratio. So a ratio that tells you what is the status of the patient. So what do you see in practice is that there's a lot of uncertainty in the data. So there are background artifacts, there are different sizes of cells, so different circles, disks that we're looking for. They have a different height. There are different noise types. And you even cannot see here in this picture, for example, what is really the problem. So it's much more complicated than what you see here right now. And what people know is that automatically detecting the underlying latent structure in those pictures, even although it's so uncertain, is what is important to understand it biologically. Because there's not just a tumor cell, yes or no, but there are things in between. There is half a tumor cell or apoptotic, so dying tumor cell, and so on. So having a much more precise separation of the different eigenfaces of a tumor cell would be fundamental for good prediction. And we could show that this is possible and that this pays off. So how is it related to functional analysis and PDE methods? So one way is to see it very simple first as a scale space approach, where you look at a gradient flow. Here the gradient flow is the subgradient, because it's a total variation as a minimizer, and that looks at the discontinuities in your pictures, and it measures the level set length. So it measures the length of your contours. And what you can do is you could try with this gradient flow, try to capture when does, in an iterative scheme, so you update this gradient flow as a time discrete process, when does the level set length or the contour have a jump in a spectral response? So when does something significant happen? So when do I see the first big cell, when the next smaller, and so on? And here you see this as a picture. So if you have a denoising process that with different regularization parameters, so here it would relate to different time steps of your sequence, you would observe that some objects diminish earlier than others, and it seems to be related to the size of the object and the height. This can be captured with a new theory for the previous 3 to 5 years. It's called, for one homogeneous functionals, you can compute a gradient flow, and that's then a nonlinear eigenvalue problem. That's what you see here. It's an eigenvalue inclusion. So you can do it for more general functionals like this. And what is very nice that over time, through this diffusion process, they show a kink in this second derivative if something significant happens in the diffusion process. So the hope would be that when you add all of those kinks, all of those impulses, that they would give you a nice representation of your input picture that you put in. So it gives you actually a spectral, and you can prove that this is the case. So you get, even for these nonlinear eigenvalue problems, a spectral representation. So it fulfills a Parseval identity. So the norm of your function is really represented fully. So the thing that I have in mind, and I cannot address it perfectly yet, is to do the same thing with a multi-scale deep net. But we get close to this. So here I show you some of the results we did before with these tumor cells as test cases. So it's related to the talk we saw in the morning where we analyzed the underlying shapes. So we see here different sizes of shapes and here different intensities. If you take a gradient flow that has an L2 data fidelity, then you will be able to see the different sizes. If you take a gradient flow with an L1 data fidelity, it is contrast invariant, and it sees mainly the length of the contour. So it will give you a spectral response, so a measure of the second derivative that is significant every time when a some object pops up. So you can really represent when this is object coming out and with which level set length and contour. And that can be very advantageous, even for very non-standard eigenfunctions. So here you see a picture at the top left. That's could be a brain structure or some blood vessel structure. And you want to analyze the spectral response of that geometry. And if you take the eigenfunctions and connect them step by step, you will see that at distinct geometric locations, so for example, when you have a junction point, there the spectral response will be more significant than in the steps where you go through the pipe eigenfunction by eigenfunction. So the ground states here are related to the eigenfunctions. That's what I want to highlight here. And you see that nicely in the response. When you take the L1 related gradient flow, you see significant elements of the graphs automatically coming out of the diffusion, and you will cover the full graph. There will be no remaining noise or point that you cannot detect. So I think this is very powerful for clustering as well, data clustering. So we applied this related question also for deep nets. And here you see a very simple first step we took. And already with that step, we got to quite good accuracy, just saying tumor cell yes or no. But that's not really helpful in practice, because that's what people achieved manually already with extracting features and so on. So we wanted to have the picture on the right-hand side with a very similar good quality. So one of our PhD students, Leonie Soine, managed to combine the autoencoding structures with the classification of such cells. And here I give you a hint why this is related to the autoencoder gradient flows. So if you look at the energy of a variational framework, where this could be a wavelet or some other frame, and here this would be the norm, and when you have a shift with some regular part, then the corresponding autoencoding structure that would appear here is in the form of a gradient flow. So what is nice is you can connect the eigenvalue problem, the differential equation, and the pre-CA in one setup. So here the question is, how should you sample through time? And that's the question of these unrolled schemes. I will explain a bit later. So it was very interesting to see the disks this morning. So we had actually a similar idea, and looked at a ground truth database and took first an denoising autoencoder setup where we wanted to see is the latent space able to capture the disks and their size, independent of the noise first, even if we test it on the underlying latent code on different noise types. And what you see is that when you train it purely on no noise data, so it has never seen a noisy scenario, the latent space will get confused at some point. But it's quite remarkable how robust it is already till quite high noise levels. If you then put the uncertainty in your training data, it is even more impressive that although you trained it just for one instance of noise, it is quite robust against nearly all of the noise levels. So, and that I think is because you project the latent space into such a small dimension, here it will be the size of the objects, that it is robust against all the possible inputs you can think of. So it's very robust via autoencoding. And it's a bit resembled here by the residual, that you see that with more noise levels in the residual, this is really captured. You can look at this as in the same way for not the height, so the oscillations in your data, but also in the level set length. So here we looked at, we did the same thing, but the variation was now the size of the object in the training set. And again, you see that with no noise in the data, you can nicely identify the different radii. And if you train it even on the right radii, it's getting much more robust. So we can separate objects more clearly. So what is missing here is showing really the latent space. I will show you that in another scenario. The good story is, and this is really a summary of a lot of work that we put in, is we have a framework that was really a highlight in the evaluation that can show with very high likelihoods the different types of cells underlying. And we were able by an incremental approach, so something like an incrementally building up of the autoencoding structures in the latent space, we could find new cell classes that were not identified before. And that's really the secret of the biologists. That's what they usually want to have. So this was a combination of autoencoding and classification, capturing more and more classes in the underlying latent code. So I showed you an example here that was on the right-hand side of this diagram. So it was about latent representation of data. So now I will put the inverse problem into the scenario. So here the example is photoacoustic tomography, very challenging inverse problem because it combines photonics and acoustics. And to give you the main idea of this area, I will just focus on the acoustic problem. So where you have basically the wave equation like in radar type imaging. But what we really want to highlight is that there's so much to gain in this area because it is a radiative transfer equation combined with the acoustic transport. So the idea is that you send in light, heat up the tissue, it deforms, and then via this deformation, a pressure wave is generated that can be detected by sound outside. That's why it's called photoacoustic. So if you simplify it quite a bit, then the wave equation can be represented in a convolutional sense here over time. And what is really one uncertain element is what the physicists call the calibration in their system. It's something like a calibration kernel. It's the impulse response. So you send in an impulse into your system and you want to know what is the basic pattern that it gives you. It's like a convolution kernel in time. So keep this in mind. I will show it at the end of the talk. I will show you this part again. So it's an uncertain element that has a strong influence on the quality of a reconstruction, and our real inverse problem is inverting this. So the idea is that with acoustic detectors here at the top and maybe a breast cancer scenario where you look at the angiogenesis, so all these small structures you want to detect, and if they are significantly different, you get closer to the tumor because usually the angiogenesis is feeding, it's like a feeding element for the tumor growth. So we are interested in reconstructing such scenarios where there's very high quality. That would be the hope. And the question is, can deep learning methods be helpful to either learn the equations better, so learning more the underlying physics, or can it be used to stabilize the reconstruction algorithm, so for regularizing the system? So those are the classical algorithms we have seen by the talk of Ozan in the morning. So we have direct reconstruction methods like filter back projection. They would take data and you have something like a truncated SVD as a solution if the operator is not nonlinear. Then there are primal dual optimization methods. Famous one is primal dual hybrid gradient. So use alternating proximal point methods for the primal and the duals. That would be the classical solution method for TV reconstruction. Or you use learned methods, and they were exactly these ones that were good 2 years ago. So where you first reconstruct and then use something like a UNet. So we saw in Ozan's talk that this is not optimal. This is not what you want as a basic approach. But it's already much better than the upper two, which were both motivated by variational and PDE frameworks. So we are interested in getting a better idea of what the regularizer should be. Should it be TV? Should it be higher order TV? Should it be wavelets or shielded related? Or can we learn the regularization? Or the underlying eigenfunctions that we need to describe the regularization for a given data set. So this is the learned primal dual method you have seen already. In a simple form where you assume that operator A and A adjoint is used. So we have here a primal dual algorithm. You can extend it to learning the prox term from a network. So this is quite reasonable because often prox terms are just projections. So if you have simple diffusions, you can clearly write it as convolution combinations with nonlinearities. Or if you go even one step further, you can also learn which iteration steps should you use in your unrolled scheme. So should you be very implicit, or should you group your iterates? Should you have a delay in there? So you could think about learned optimization schemes. Preconditioning would be part of that as well. So it turns out that those methods have, in principle, no regularization parameter anymore, because you learn how much you iterate. You might have a semi-convergence. You have to stop at the right moment. You have, in principle, better robustness to noise. I think that's what we observe practically, but it's not clear. And you have faster reconstruction, but it is not really proven stability that you can get. So the problem is a bit, we have an energy, and we know what kind of optimality condition we would like to get, but these two worlds are not clearly connected. So here you see an unrolled scheme as a graph. So you have one big network that combines, in each step, subnetworks of convolutional type, for example. So here the colors indicate to the equations on the top that you get a rough idea of what this learned network would do. That's an unrolled scheme. We use this in practice and try to see in photoacoustic how much we could resemble the sensitivity in our data and in our problem. What was surprising is that we could train it with retina data, although we were looking for blood vessels in the breast. So the transfer learning is quite successful in this area because we look at blood vessel structures in both scenarios. Here you see the detailed parameters we used. It's also quite remarkable that we used a quite small number of training samples for this. I think that's because we're nearly looking for a segmentation with some topological properties, but not more. If it's more diverse, more complicated, like the Facebook data we have seen, then you have to think more about it. That's clear. So here we look at the sensitivity in image changes. That means you have a training data set, and maybe the training data set does not fully resemble what you see in your test scenario. We're looking at generalization. What is, so C0, C1, and so on are different properties of the training set. So we changed exactly the things that would matter in a latent space. We changed the expansion, we changed the intensity, small speckles in the data, the noise level, and so on. What you observe is that there's one network that we learned with the underlying data, although it is not from the same latent code, can reconstruct quite robustly the system. If you would do this with a filter back projection, you have no chance to get it back, because there's so much uncertainty in the data. So the robustness to image changes in the training set is quite useful, like we did for the tumor cells. But what is really an open question, and here you see this supported by the PSNR values of the scenario, so you really get a huge boost from roughly 20 to 40. And even with a deeper network, you don't gain much more. So it's really an intrinsic uncertainty in the system that you would need to boost it even more. So strong noise removal, background identification is all possible with learned primal dual methods, and they are quite robust against significant changes in the image. So we already heard in the previous talk about meta-learning methods. So you combine reconstruction or classification with another task that you are interested in. Here, in this task, it is a segmentation. People would like to have a reconstruction and simultaneously want to know how much vessel is there or how close I'm to the tumor. So in the photoacoustic scenario, it's even more complicated because you have often what's called the fluence. So you have a transport through the system that diminishes the signal while walking through the system, so through the tissue. Let's see what you see here in the initial pressure you're looking for. So here, a TV prior would not help at all, would give you stack casing effects. So in those scenarios, the combination of these networks with a higher level task, like segmentation, worked out nicely. So we used that, and we're not only looking for a reconstruction, but also for segmentation. And I think that would also hold if you have an autoencoder inside, because these two solutions would share the underlying eigenfunctions that you can identify. So this is also shown here in the numerics quite clearly. You have a ground truth on the left that shows this depth penetration nicely. The filter back projection is not able to find the deeper vessels. And if you take a DV prior, you have a staircasing effect and you have too much reduction of intensities. And with the UNet as post-processing, you get better. But with this learned primal dual, you get much better. If you now combine it with the segmentation, this is even more impressive. And that's the thing that we observe. If you have hybrid methods, often that profits from each other. Okay, so let me get more to the mathematics back. Right now we are quite heuristics here. But what you see really is that the deeper penetration through the tissue is working better. We see that there are vessels here, whereas here I would not really trust much, and especially not here. And depth penetration is fundamental in photoacoustics because often the optical transmission is not really significant. So people have a problem that they can just use it on the surface of the tissue and not very deep. So therefore, this is a useful contribution. So here you see even a real scenario where you have filter back projection, TV, UNet, and this learned primal dual method, and you can see that some elements are really missing that you can get back in the depth. And if you take this scenario with the fluence even on top of it, it's getting even more significant. So you see clearly that here you get much deeper in the reconstruction than you could get here or here. Okay. So now the important part with respect to operator learning. What we really are interested in is learning the equations or learning the hidden functions that are in there. That's not what I did till now. Now I just showed you when you take the right setup for learning, a learned unrolled scheme can detect already a lot of image changes. But maybe that's not enough in a more complicated differential equation like a radiative transfer equation. There you have attenuation and scattering, and these things can interact in an extreme way. So how to generalize in those scenarios, and I think latent space structures is a really good idea. So there are already a lot of papers that address first aspects on the convergence proofs for such partially learned methods. But the problem is that the gradient flow scheme is not really preserved, which you would need for a lot of PDE methods. So you're having the right metric showing you the right equations in the limiting process. So that's what we try to achieve with this first test. And it's not yet, I think, strong, but it gives you a good intuition that we can learn functionals and terms in functionals. So you have here a minimizing functional, and we say we have one term with the one norm, that could be the data fidelity, and we have one term that is based on L2, so it could be a Sobolev space norm, a semi-norm, or it could be maybe something more higher order. And we give it an underlying structure for this coupled Q1 and Q2. So this operator here is shared in one network. And we do not make too many assumptions on the network. Can the network detect the right functional from the data? That was the question we asked ourselves here. And can we detect it via the corresponding correct gradient flow from the functional analysis that might resemble the same behavior as the unrolled scheme that we saw before, where you really define the network in advance everywhere. So this is, roughly speaking, the network. It could be arbitrarily complicated even with autoencoders inside. But let's take it simple. So you just write down the gradient flow here. It's just an L2 gradient flow. And you see here a nice term coming up. That was the same I had before in the autoencoding schemes. Yeah, so we have here bilinear forms where you're interested in learning their contribution. And okay, I will show you just some results to not give you too many details. So we have learned then the gradient and the operator in combination. And for that one, we have an unrolled scheme that can be quite long. But the question is, where should we stop when we really have a convergent behavior? So we took a coil data set where we see typical behaviors of TV functionals, but also of higher order TV functionals. So we want to see, can it capture the discontinuities and the gradient structure in the data? We gave it also quite noisy inputs to see if it identifies the uncertainty in the data fidelity, so in the residual of our system. What you see is that this learned gradient descent method, which is now following a functional minimization, is giving you something that you would expect from a TV prior in combination with a higher order TV prior. So you see some parts are quite smooth, but the noise is reduced nicely. So when you look at these things a bit more in detail, and I could also show you some formulas for this, there's a clear reduction of noise step by step. And at the end, you converge to a term that resembles the regularity and the operator that you need to relate data to relate to the residual in your data, so to the noise. And these are now the learned operators per iteration. So you see that it first learns in the data fidelity the underlying noise, different levels of noise in the foreground and in the background. And at the end, the underlying Q function is quite much resembling the residual. This is the interesting one. What do you see here? You see here the regularization operator that was learned. So you see clearly an underlying edge, if you go from left to right, and that was the more dominant one. And you also see that it first learns the final scales and then later on the rough scales. So you have clearly a multi-scale detection in the network. And that's why I think it's possible to give a spectral response of this as well. What is even more remarkable is that now the network is even a full gradient descent scheme. And you can see that after roughly 20 iterations, that was the estimate that also Ozan gave, around 10 to 20 iterations, you can see in an unrolled schemes quite a good success. So what happened in between here is automatically preconditioning and step size selection. Because you have the structure of the unrolled scheme, but it also comes from a gradient flow. And I think that's really, these mixtures are really useful. You also see that the learning of the loss is going down to those points, but here you have semi-convergence because you overfit, as you would usually have. With more training data, you have to find a balance. Okay? But it's, I think, really clear that this is a good reconstruction from a medical imaging point of view. This is a bit the outlook. There are a lot of gradient flows that you can address, and I just showed you two of them. So one is for the classification, the other one is for this nonlinear diffusion process. But you can think about the classical PDE approaches and use either variational networks, or you use the classical ODE theory, embedding theorems, or you use the physics-informed methods. So going in this diagram I showed you from left to right or from right to left. And you can step by step think about learning parts of it. An even more complicated version of this one would be this photoacoustic operator. That's even more complicated than the one that you have here at the bottom. But that's a bit what I hope we can achieve at some point. So connecting variational frameworks with gradient flows and learning parts of it significantly. And I think motivated, I think what's happening here a lot in France is really the optimal transport that connects variational autoencoders and generative networks. That will be the key part to give structure in those learned operators. So here you see a representation of input data. These could be images to the latent space back to the images, and that you have a discriminator and a generating network. There's a nice relationship of density fitting. That would be the inverse problem that we just talked about. And the encoding of data via transport. And for sure, the underlying barycenters and their Frichier means that you want to find. So really the PCA counterparts. So we did that here for the photoacoustic scenario. That's the last example I will show you. So we looked at the equation for wave transport, but now we parameterized the calibration. So we didn't calibrate at all, but usually the physicists do for a lot of time. They spend a lot of time in identifying this pCal. So we just said, generate some samples, and then let's see if the latent space tells us what are the significant calibrations you would need. And how much is the transition in the latent space, so if you migrate through it, how much is it sensitive to this estimation? So this is the calibration we would like to get. This is the impulse response. This is a typical signal we see from the wave propagation. This is the acoustic signal. And can we learn the pCal? That's what's the question here. And with this variational autoencoder, with a very standard prior assumption on the latent space, it is possible to get back this picture for this scenario, where you see that the autoencoding basically has worked. if you are in a nice region, but there are other regions where there's an overlap. So we looked at numerically, but also a bit analytically, what could go wrong in this transition when you migrate through it. And what you see is that this extracted R of x given z, so really seeing what is the impulse response that you estimated, how much does that change in the latent representation? And what you see is that it is quite consistent and quite easy to get. So then we took some more complicated scenario and detected that this is not always the case. So really a regularization of this latent code is not really needed here, but in other scenarios it is. So I will show you just a very simple MNIST scenario where this goes wrong and is problematic. And right now this is where we continue with the research. So you see here an artificially generated physics-calibrated MNIST. So we took the fives, all the fives that we had in the database, and we manipulated with an impulse response that we wanted to train. We manipulated the fives to different geometries. So we rotated it, we convolved it, we shifted it, and so on. But we took the kernel that we wanted to have for this photoacoustic scenario. And that's what you basically then see here as a distribution. And it's very obvious that interpolation in this scenario is not so easy. So when you go through this code and try to represent it, it is not going well. And even with regularization, so that's here one regularization parameter, another regularization parameter, an even stronger one, it's going closer and closer to the desired Gaussian shape, but it is unfortunately having a clear folding. So that means you even increase the likelihood of having strong transition points. And that's what you see here nicely. So from 5 to this one here, there's not a clear smooth transition. So what I hope is that this step is not happening if you take the right prior assumption with, for example, generalized geometrics like Riemannian manifolds, optimal transport. You would get this estimate much better, and that the regularization is much more a smooth geometry that you get. So this seems to not happen with generative networks, with GANs. They perform much better. So what I hope is that because variational autoencoders are so much nicely funded by, they have a nice backbone in statistics, and with the generative networks, it's often difficult, especially for optimization. I hope that this is something where we can improve in both parts, so on the image representation, but also on the operator representation. Okay, so to summarize my talk, I showed you something about nonlinear eigenvalue problems. I think that's still a way to go. So from these nonlinear eigenvalue problems, learning the different PDs. The robustness, I think, is practically very obvious. And also there, eigenvalues that you can detect for your system will resemble what regularization scheme you should use. I think the functional learning, or the gradient descent learning, is really an added benefit because it comes from energies and gives you an unrolled scheme that has a proof convergence. That I think is important, even if you threshold at some point. And I think the generative networks will be very useful for operator learning, but also for data latent space representation. Yeah, so here you see the two areas we worked on. They were both driven by applications. So the first two papers were on the tumor cell analysis of cancer ID, and the second one is on a new project called PAMOTH. I think also Haltmeier is very strongly active in this area. So that's where the photoacoustic scenario is learned and improved. So thanks for your attention.
So questions for Christoph?
In photoacoustic imaging, I think that the equations, the propagation and diffusion equations are in general non-linear. But here you wrote a kind of linear approximation of these equations, no?
That's correct. The wave equation is, let's say, the simpler one of the two equations that come up in photoacoustics. In photoacoustics, the real challenge is not what we actually addressed here, but it is the photonic problem, so the one that connects attenuation and scattering. And even there, people use a lot diffusion approximations, so they approximate the complicated nonlinearity by a more linear one. But I think exactly there, the nonlinear networks can have a huge impact. So we took on purpose here something very simple that relates to also imaging problems like super resolution or convolutional problems. But if we cannot address those ones and understand them in terms of autoencoders, we have missed something. So that's why we start with that. But the next step is for sure, yeah, what everyone wants.
Thanks, Christoph, for a nice talk. I was wondering, when you were training in this joint reconstruction and segmentation networks together, what loss did you use?
Yeah, we tried different losses. One was, I forgot the name, but where you the loss that you use also for unbalanced training, where you combine it not only in an additive way, but you have a weight in between. Yeah. But actually we compared it to just a simple additive combination, so where you just have two L2 losses, and it was much very, very competitive. So it was from a numerical point of view, there was no reason to take a very specific loss. Yeah. But I think it is also because our scenario was still easy. So if you are again in this nonlinear scenario, and you then have a very complicated nonlinear operator you want to learn, so or the adjoint, and you have then a very simple segmentation thresholding you want to find, then there's a clear unbalance, and then you have to find something better.
Okay, if there's no question, let's thank Christoph for his talk.